Another week in the books and another gaffe by Sleepy Uncle Joe. Taylor Swift proves once again how little she knows about subjects outside of music and bad breakups. Massachusetts seeks to further infringe on the rights of their citizens. And the left just cannot help themselves from publishing fake news. They get owned every single time. We'll talk about all that and more. I'm Big E, and this is the Liberty Cast. Now, it's been a running gag forever that Joe Biden is a gaffe machine. He proves it all the time. He proved it while he was senator of Delaware. He proved it while he was vice president. He just can't help himself from proving it. It just is. But in this presidential run, it's gone from funny to sad. There are times when he can barely put a sentence together, and then when he does, it's incoherent at best, if not outright gibberish.
The president has done nothing but increase the tariffs, the debt, and the trade deficit. The way you have to proceed is we have to have our allies with us. It's not just us. We have to keep the rest of the world together. Secondly, labor should be at the table, as well as our allies, because that's the only thing. And the fourth thing we should do is be focusing on the things that, in fact, I've been talking about for a long time. China's greatest violation is the way in which they steal our intellectual property. We should make it quid pro quo, as I've told when I was dealing with Xi Jinping. It should be simple. Here's the deal. You say that if, in fact, anything has to be owned 50% by Chinese to invest in China, guess what? In America, it's the same thing. This idea of dealing with the only people that are paying the price are farmers and working people right now. He's going about it all the wrong way. A lot of bravado, no action.
Huh? What was that? I mean, he's up there in age. He's older than President Trump. And imagine if he was going to be in office for 2 terms. He's done. It's obvious he's done. And after that ringing endorsement from his wife, you would think that she and his family would step in and say, okay, Joe, enough's enough. Call it quits. But they don't do that, and there's really no indication right now at this point that they're going to do that, which leaves us with gems like this.
Young Navy captain, Navy, up in the mountains in the Konar Valley in Afghanistan. One of his buddies got shot, fell down a ravine about 60 feet. 4-star general asked me whether I'd go up into the fob. Now everybody got concerned, the vice president going up in the middle of this, but we can lose a vice president. We can't lose many more of these kids. This guy climbed down a ravine, carried this guy up on his back under fire. And the general wanted me to pin the silver star on him. I got up there and this is God's truth. My word is a Biden. He stood at attention. I went to pin him. I said, sir, I don't want the damn thing. Do not pin it on me, sir. Please, sir. Do not do that. He died. He died.
Now, to be fair, that was a very moving story and surprisingly well communicated given his recent difficulties in being able to communicate effectively, to put a generous spin on it. But everything about it was fiction, a complete work of fiction. And to quote the Washington Post, Biden got the time period, the location, the heroic act, the type of medal, the military branch, and the rank of the recipient wrong, as well as his own role in the ceremony. And it's not like this is the first time. He has several different versions of this story that he's told for years. And each one gets more and more harrowing, more and more heartrending than the last one. And it's ridiculous. Is he lying? Maybe. Is he embellishing? Definitely. Does he really think these things happened? At this point, as many times as he's told these stories, and as much of a factor as his age is now, who knows? But he seems a bit taken aback by the amount of criticism that he's getting for telling this demonstrably inaccurate story. And he defended himself by saying that the essence of the story is correct. Well, no, it's not. He says he was making a point about how courageous our soldiers are and how incredible they are. And then goes on to say that he doesn't know what the problem is and asks the question, what is it that he said was wrong? Okay. If you have to ask that question, then you probably shouldn't be running a 7-Eleven, much less running for the office of President of the United States. But I mean, you expect Joe Biden to defend himself. You expect him to try and spin it. But someone else is actually defending him as well. Our good friend and former Sarah Huckabee Sanders punching bag, April Ryan. Listen to this.
Correspondent for the New York Times. April, are these significant differences in the story he's telling here?
Yes, there are significant differences, but Jim, what you have to look at, we are in a climate of lies being thrown at us from the President of the United States, and we're so hypersensitive about issues of lies. People who are prone to gaffes, we are now holding them to the same standard, putting that bright spotlight on, looking at it as a lie like this president tells versus saying, oh, that's Joe Biden, he is prone to gaffing. At issue is the fact that this Staff Sergeant Workman did say, you know, he died, do not pin the medal on me. Mm-hmm. All the other stuff is important, but was it something that it's been so long and he just couldn't get the story right, or was it an out-and-out lie? That's the question. And we have someone in the White House who we know is a liar, point blank. And now this person who's running for president is known to gaffe. He needs to get it right if he tells the story. But was it intentional? That's the question. And I don't think it was.
That was the orange man bad defense. Or Manny being Manny. For those of you who remember Manny Ramirez from the Boston Red Sox back in the day, he was a goofball and he would do dumb stuff. And because he was such a good player, everybody just dismissed it as Manny being Manny. And because Joe Biden is quote unquote likable, whenever he makes some of these stupid gaffes, it's just that Joe, he's gaffe prone. That's just Joe being Joe. But the essence of it is Orange Man bad. And since Orange Man is bad, everything else is irrelevant. Come on. What kind of nonsense is that? I mean, it's not like he wasn't even talking about President Trump. But she has to inject her feelings about the president into this ridiculous. I mean, come on. Like I said, Joe Biden, I'm fairly certain, is done. He's in a statistical dead heat with Elizabeth Warren. I suspect in the next week or so, she will surge past him, thereby delivering the death blow to his campaign, because his staff is already trying to limit his exposure, trying to limit his appearances to reduce the number and severity of his quote unquote gaffes. And once she surges past him in the polls, he's going to have to step up his game, and they're already scaling it back. And I just don't see how he can regain a lead with that kind of campaign strategy. Anyway, moving on. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Try telling that to the state of Massachusetts. Because the state of Massachusetts this past week heard arguments on a number of gun legislation, proposed gun legislation, and those people up there they're crazy, anti-Second Amendment, anti-constitutional lunatics up there. And I can say that because that is the state from which I escaped to come here to Texas. So I can tell you from experience that their gun laws were terrible back then. And they've only gotten worse, and they're only going to, I mean, ban the AR-15. It's only going to get worse. But some of the laws that they already have in place are just ridiculous. Massachusetts is a may issue state for licenses to carry firearms. You need a permit in order to purchase a firearm. Surprisingly, though, they do allow open carry if you have a permit, which when I read that, I was shocked. But they require background checks on private gun sales. They have a magazine restriction of no more than 10 rounds, and some of the legislation that they are proposing is to limit that even more. They have red flag laws in place, and yet with all those restrictions, Massachusetts is still the most violent state in the northeastern United States, and that includes New York and New Jersey. And when you have states like New Hampshire and Vermont that have constitutional carry and very good, by comparison, gun laws. In fact, according to the FBI in 2016, 3 of the safest states in the country were Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Massachusetts has a murder rate 6 times that of Vermont. And Vermont has, for all intents and purposes, no gun laws. How do these people explain what happens? How do they explain how these places with the most restrictive gun laws are the most violent? Massachusetts, Chicago, Detroit, California. I mean, it defies logic to think that if you take the guns out of law-abiding citizens' hands, it defies logic and it defies statistics that if you take guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens, that crime's not going to spike. I mean, come on. But in addition to the already restrictive gun laws that Massachusetts has, there are 2 in particular that are troubling. 2 additional ones that they're considering that are troubling. And that is a bill they're considering that would allow police to trace guns used to commit crimes by creating a weapons database. Now, presumably, they're going to use the ATF's gun trace data to get this off the ground. But the problem with that is that when the ATF traces a gun, it is automatically entered into the gun crime database. Whether they were tracing that gun to determine ownership or for whatever reason, it has not necessarily been used to commit a crime to end up in that database. So they have to be very, very careful about how they implement this should it pass. And as far as I'm concerned, it should not pass, but this is Massachusetts, so there's a very high probability that this is going to end up in place. And attendant to that, there's going to be a high probability that innocent people are going to get caught up in this dragnet that they're putting out. And another one that they're trying to push is a favorite of the anti-constitutional, anti-Second Amendment crowd, and that is they want law-abiding gun owners to carry liability insurance for that firearm or for those firearms. And it's just another tactic for them to try and price people out of gun ownership. But all is not lost, because there are actually 2 decent bills that are on the docket that they discussed this past week. One of them is House Bill 2122, an act relative to constitutional rights. And it basically just puts on the books, should it pass, that the right to keep and bear arms, it puts it into law that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual civil right in the state of Massachusetts, which it is. And the fact that they actually need this legislation is ridiculous, but it's one of the few decent bills that they're considering. And another one is House Bill 2144, an act relative to firearm owners' protection. And this law allows law-abiding gun owners to transport firearms across state lines as long as they are unloaded and stored in the trunk or a locked container. This law protects out-of-state or people who are not residents of the state of Massachusetts while traveling through the state, so that they don't get harassed by the police should they get stopped and the cop sees guns in the car. I mean, it shouldn't be an issue regardless. But the fact that someone in the state of Massachusetts is thinking about this and trying to put it into law to protect the constitutional rights of people outside of the state who travel to and through the state. So as Massachusetts gun legislation goes, this isn't too bad. I am so glad that I do not live in Massachusetts anymore. You have no idea. But anyway, I want to talk to you about another Second Amendment story, and it's a follow-up to something we talked about last week, and I will tell you all about that after this quick break. So a couple of weeks ago, I told you about those 5 Democrat senators that filed an amicus brief that basically threatened the Supreme Court if they didn't rule a certain way on a case. Well, this week, all 53 Republican senators signed a letter that they sent to the Supreme Court urging them to ignore the amicus brief that those senators filed. Let me just read this last bit because it's really well done. We are deeply concerned by our colleagues' amicus brief and the ideas it promotes. We take no position on the underlying Second Amendment question, nor on the mootness issue currently before the court. But judicial independence is not negotiable. We will brook no threats to this fundamental precept of our constitutional structure. We therefore ask that the justices fulfill their oaths to faithfully and impartially follow the law. They should rule in this case only as the law dictates, without regard to the identity of the parties or the politics of the moment. They must not be cowed by the threats of opportunistic politicians. Our constitutional republic depends on an independent judiciary ruling impartially on the basis of what the law says. We ask that the justices stand firm and do their part to protect our government of laws, not of men. For our part, we promise this. While we remain members of this body, the Democrats' threat to restructure the court is an empty one. We share Justice Ginsburg's view that 9 seems to be a good number, and it will remain that way as long as we are here. Nice. I like that. I'll have a link to the letter up on the LibertyCast so you can read the whole thing for yourself. It's short, but I appreciate it. They need to challenge the leftists in the Senate and the House like this more often. And they need to go public with this stuff. Not that they're not going public, but they need to be out in front of the public. They need to be on camera. They need to be on radio. They need to do more evangelizing for the Republican cause, for the conservative movement, because right now they're getting killed in the PR department. For too long, they've just sat back and said, the left's ideas are terrible. There's no way that they can win, and yet they're winning the public opinion battle. They're winning the PR battle. And if the Republicans had some people out and about, front and center, championing the conservative point of view and directly refuting the left's narrative, they'd hardly ever lose. So when they do stuff like this, I want to make sure that it gets out there. All right, I have a few other stories I really want to get to. So we're going to continue the march here and talk about someone that we haven't really talked much about lately. And I don't know if you noticed, but ever since Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez fired her chief of staff, she hadn't really been around much. We hadn't really heard much from her on social media or anywhere else. And that kind of suggests that maybe he was the brains, quote unquote, of the operation, but she's back, and I'm sure you have heard about. Well, maybe you haven't, but she had a little Instagram video that she did where she touted the millennials, her generation, as the greatest generation.
I think young people are more informed and dynamic than their predecessors. I think that they are more sensitive in a positive way, in that they actually care about other people's experiences and lives. And one thing that I love so much about this new generation is the radical acceptance that I see from so many. And they actually take time to read and understand our history, the history of the labor movement, history of civil rights, history of racial struggles, history of economics, history of the United States, history of colonialism. And they're not afraid to have those conversations. If anything, like, I think they're profoundly courageous because they're willing to puncture taboos and have conversations that frankly older generations sometimes struggle to have. Not everyone. I don't want to paint everybody with a broad brush, but I think this new generation is very profound and very strong and very brave because they're actually willing to go to the streets. How about that?
How about that? Now, I don't even have to ask the question because I know she's serious right now, but she could not be more wrong if she said 2 + 2 = apple. I mean, not only is her generation, the millennials, not only are millennials not the greatest generation, but they are the most ignorant, most self-absorbed, self-important generation. Not even close to the greatest. And that Instagram video was all the proof we should need, even though she's given us proof pretty much since she jumped on the scene that she's a complete moron. But she actually said in that video that her generation was well-versed in American history. Meanwhile, she's trying to tell everyone that we're a democracy and not a republic. We'll get back to that in a second. But let's leave her profound ignorance aside for a second and just take the generation as a whole, like she said. There was a YouGov poll late last year where they surveyed more than 1,000 people from age 14 all the way up, and they asked them about their knowledge of American history. And also they asked about how they felt about the country in terms of patriotism and things like that. This survey found that Generation Z and millennials are less likely to love and respect the United States and are profoundly ignorant of this country's history. In fact, 87% of high school students surveyed flunked a 5-question test about American history, the worst of any age group. In fact, a third of the millennials that took this test failed to get a single correct answer. 17% of millennials actually passed. 41% of millennials knew how many amendments are in the Bill of Rights. 17% of them, millennials, know when the Constitution was ratified. 18% of millennials know who authored the Federalist Papers. 19% cannot name the 5 freedoms guaranteed under the First Amendment. My goodness. 46% of millennials didn't know who was on Mount Rushmore. Now, this survey is a small sample size. I admit that. I'll put a link to it up on the website so you can see the methodology, you can see the questions that were asked, and you can see the breakdowns and things like that. But it's still scary, and to anyone who's paying attention, who sees this survey and pays attention to what's going on with the younger generation these days, it's kind of hard to argue with the results. And when you consider that they've been indoctrinated from day one by leftist teachers and professors, this is the only logical result. And I would say that the people at BU, where she graduated, are cringing, but when you think about it from that perspective of the leftist indoctrination, they're probably sitting back clapping, thinking about how good a job they did. And I know some people who went to BU, and I guarantee that they are following AOC on Twitter and Instagram, and I guarantee that they fall right in line with everything that she's saying. I guarantee it. So when people say the people at BU should take their degree, but no, I don't think so. I don't believe that. I think they are happy with the results. Now, earlier I mentioned that I was going to get back to AOC and her assertion that the United States is a democracy. And earlier this week on Twitter, she said that Republicans are arguing that the United States is not and should not be a democracy. And she went on to tweet some drivel about the GOP sabotaging civil rights and working to end democracy, and that we, meaning her and her ilk, have to grow democracy. Republicans are arguing that the United States is not and should not be a democracy because it is not and it should not. This is not difficult. The United States is a constitutional republic. Democracy is majority rule. I know it's a somewhat overused quote, but it rings true in this case. Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. And that's the way it would be if we were a democracy. It would be all the elites concentrated in the urban areas, in the metropolitan areas, New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Dallas, all the major metropolitan, San Francisco. Those are densely populated areas that would just run roughshod all over the rest of the country and impose all of their ridiculous laws, all of their ridiculous restrictions. The Second Amendment would be a thing of the past. So when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her millennial ilk say that we need a popular vote, direct democracy, that's what they're talking about. Greatest generation, please. Because they're more sensitive and well-versed in history. Oh, and let's not forget, because millennials are more willing to take it to the streets. Did she seriously say that? I know she did. I know I acknowledge that she was serious, but she this is what I mean by the self-absorbed mentality of the millennials. She's completely forgetting and discounting what the people did in the civil rights era and the civil rights movement. They took it to the streets. They took it to the jails. They sacrificed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and millennials are benefiting from the sacrifice of previous generations, and they haven't had to sacrifice a damn thing. Millennials in the military and fighting in uniform notwithstanding, those people are excluded, obviously. Such a vapid, vacuous, insipid, ridiculous. All right, speaking of vapid, vacuous, and insipid, let's move on. I can't believe I'm talking about this person 2 weeks in a row, but Taylor Swift said something ridiculous again.
At the end of this video, there was a petition, and there still is a petition, for the Equality Act, which basically just says we all deserve equal rights under the law. And I want to thank everyone who signed that petition, because it now has 500,000 signatures, which is 5 times the amount that it would need to warrant a response from the White House.
Has she read the bill that has this petition out for? Probably not. She clearly has no idea what she's talking about. Now, first, it's not a White House petition. It was a change.org petition. And it wasn't addressed to the White House. It was addressed to the Senate. Now, even if she had done a We the People petition that was addressed to the White House or addressed as change.org, well, no, not even that. Regardless, the White House is under no obligation to respond to any of these ridiculous petitions. They're not. They respond to the We the People whitehouse.gov petitions as a courtesy, I guess, as a PR move, maybe. But they're under no obligation. But getting back to the Equality Act petition, or getting back to the Equality Act itself, I guarantee she hasn't read it. And her assertion that it guarantees that everybody has equal rights under the law, it sounds great in theory. But the vagueness with which this bill was written is ridiculous. I mean, how do you enforce something as vague, as nebulous as gender identity? I mean, how many genders do they claim are in existence now? 6,742? I've lost count. Now, the bill prohibits an individual from being denied access to a shared facility, including a restroom, locker room, and dressing room that is in accordance with the individual's gender identity. Let's just think this through for a second. We've already been over the whole restroom deal and the dressing room deal. Those are just creepy, and it defies logic that anyone could possibly think that that was a good idea. But what I want to focus on is the locker room. What kind of locker rooms are they talking about? Are they talking about gym locker rooms? Are they talking about high school locker rooms? Does it matter which one they're talking about? I say it does not matter, because why would you? We just talked about that trans activist from Canada a couple weeks ago, Jessica Yaniv, who was going around trying to get women in salons to wax his balls. And now we have a federal law being proposed that would make it illegal for that person to deny Jessica Yaniv or anyone like him service. And what happens in a high school when you have guys pretending to be girls so that they can win because they can't beat other guys? There's going to be teenage boys in a locker room with girls. And that will, by law, they will have to be let in. They will have to have access. Now, I was a teenage boy. That would not be a good idea. I mean, seriously, what parents are going to want their teenage girls in the same locker room with boys? Who cares what they identify as? Who cares if they claim to be transitioning? 9 times out of 10, the only reason they're doing it is because they weren't good enough to beat any guys, any boys on their high school track team or whatever. So, or tennis or whatever the sport may be. So they figure they have the advantage. They can beat up on the girls in the school and take their scholarships away and take their trophies away. I mean, it's just, come on. Now, according to the DSM-5, the percentage of males diagnosed with gender dysphoria caps out at 0.014%. Yet it seems like there's a flood of stories about these transgender, quote unquote, boys dominating girls' athletics. So not only is there going to be a federal law, if it passes, forcing girls to be in the same locker room as boys, but then those boys are just destroying any future that these girls had in athletics, the Sharia law of American sports. And this is going to be federally mandated if this were to pass. And I mean, it defies logic. It defies all common sense. But there are actually people out there fighting for this. They are actually claiming that these boys and these men that are pretending to be women and girls, because they say they are, magically their junk falls off and they become women and girls. I mean, what? Laura Ingraham said it best in one of her books a long time ago. Shut up and sing. So this is my advice to Taylor Swift. Shut up and, well, I don't know if you could call what she does singing, but shut up and stay in your lane. Whatever that lane might be, but it's not public policy. That much I do know. All right, there's a few other stories I want to get to, so we're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll get into those and then get you out of here with This Week in Stupidity. So, Dave Chappelle has a new comedy special, and I have never really been a huge fan of Dave Chappelle. I was not a fan of the Chappelle Show. I never really thought his stand-up was that great. He had some funny bits, but he was never one of the comedians that I enjoyed listening to. But I heard some good things about his latest one that's on Netflix, and I heard about it from people on the left and the right, which I found pretty interesting. So this past weekend, my wife and I watched it, and I have to say it was pretty hilarious. He's offensive. He says some words that he uses the N-word liberally, which I'm not a fan of. But overall, overall, I have to say that I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected. He's getting criticism about this special from the left and the right, which if the left is criticizing you and the right is criticizing you as a comedian, you know you pretty much nailed it. And I think he did. I don't agree with him politically. He made some political points that I didn't agree with. He made some that I found pretty interesting. One of the good points that he made had to do with what's come to be known as cancel culture. And that's where if you say something some group doesn't like, and it's usually the left, then they're going to do everything they possibly can to cancel you, get you fired, get your show off the air, whatever. Just look at Roseanne. She tweeted something offensive, and within hours, her show was canceled. Or it wasn't canceled, but she was fired. Sarah Silverman, leftist media darling, who I can't believe I'm actually kind of defending right now, was recently fired from a movie because of a bit she did back in 2007 for her old show, where she wore blackface. Offensive. Yeah, I didn't see the bit. I don't know what it was about. Don't really care. It was 2007. She apologized, but she got fired. And so Dave Chappelle was making a point about how he didn't like doing stand-up because the audience, he felt like, was always going to be looking for something to catch him on. But if you listen to any of his stand-up, not just this past one, I don't think he really cares that much. I think he was just trying to make a point because he was not holding back. And from what I understand, he never does. And it was a good one. But then he got into abortion, and I really thought I was going to be in for it. But here again, he made an interesting point. Now, he does espouse the leftist line, or at least he claimed he seemed to espouse the leftist line that if you have a male copulatory organ, you have no say in what a woman does with her body with respect to pregnancy and abortion. But he goes on to say that if a man has no say in what a woman does, then he shouldn't have to pay if she decides to keep the baby. Harsh, yes, absolutely. But there's a certain logic to it. Telling men that they have no say in the matter when it comes to a woman's right to choose, if you tell a man that, then you can't then turn around and demand that they support the baby financially if they had no say in anything up until the baby was born. Now, no one but a comedian is going to come out and say something like that publicly. But good comedians will do that. George Carlin was a classic example of saying things that were so patently offensive, but then made you think a little bit. So if you can handle some foul language and some offensive jokes and jokes that are uncomfortable to hear, might be worth checking out. I can't believe I just said that about Dave Chappelle. But anyway, moving on. The left just cannot help themselves when it comes to Donald Trump. They hate him so much that they just cannot help but report fake news.
So I want to get your reaction to what it could mean if true, and I stress if true because this is a single source who has told me that the Deutsche Bank obtained tax returns, which they do have of Donald Trump's, show that the president pays very little income tax. That's probably not going to be very surprising to people, probably not going to be especially politically damaging since he ran saying, I try to pay as little as possible. Then there's the other part, the loan documents. And that is part of what this subpoena is going after. And this single source close to Deutsche Bank has told me that Donald Trump's loan documents there show that he has co-signers. That's how he was able to obtain those loans. And that the co-signers are Russian oligarchs.
What?
Really?
That would explain, it seems to me, every kind word Donald Trump has ever said about Russia and Vladimir Putin, if true. And I stress the if true.
If true, that's not how journalism works. You don't just cite a single source and say, here you go, hope it's true. The phrase if true does not absolve you of having to do your job as a journalist. Now, Rachel Maddow, whose voice you heard in that clip, she's an opinion person. We all know who she is, and she's not bound by those same standards that Lawrence O'Donnell is. I'm not bound by those same standards, even though I try, when I'm presenting facts and data to you, I try to make sure that I get it from a number of different sources and reputable sources. No wonder President Trump always calls them fake news, because they are. And of course, he had to go and retract that story the very next day. Hours after that aired, NBC said that they don't stand by it, that it hadn't been vetted or anything. I had a few people on my social media feed share this story, and they were giddy. They were like, yeah, we finally got him. And of course, by the time I saw it, I had already seen the NBC's statement, and I said, yeah, the network disavows it, basically. And then when the retraction came out, I went to go look for that story and look for that post and say something about it, and it was gone. Now, I don't know if it was deleted or if they just blocked me from seeing it, which happens a lot these days. I can't imagine why. But yeah, it was just gone. And that happens quite often with some of my friends and some of the people that I interact with on social media. It happens quite a bit. And then there was this hashtag that was trending, Trump hates military families. Now, this stemmed from a change in U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services policy where parents whose children were not born as United States citizens, including, for example, American parents who adopted children born to non-citizens and parents who were not citizens at the time of their child's birth, but since have become citizens, they would have to apply for citizenship for those children. So everybody was up in arms. Soldiers and servicemen and other government workers who have children overseas will have to apply for citizenship. And that's simply not true. Ken Cuccinelli, the acting USCIS director, said, or he tweeted, that the new policy does not impact birthright citizenship. It only affects children who were born outside of the United States and were not United States citizens. So soldiers who have children overseas don't have to worry about it. Government workers who are Americans working overseas, diplomats and the like, do not have to worry about it. This policy does not affect them in any way. But the left, they just can't help themselves. They just cannot help themselves. All right, y'all, I'm way over time, so let's go ahead and do this. Real man of genius. So this week in stupidity, the left was apoplectic in the wake of Axios reporting that President Trump suggested detonating a nuclear weapon in the eye of a hurricane.
Well, this was an idea that was floated during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s.
We've learned
President
a lot
Trump
more.
gets a lot of his
Allegedly.
ideas about when America was sort of at its best, basically.
Yes.
Here's what Axios is reporting. During one hurricane briefing at the White House, Trump said, I got it. Why don't we nuke them? According to the source who was there. They start forming off the coast of Africa. As they move across the Atlantic, we drop a bomb inside the eye of the hurricane and it disrupts it. Why can't we do that?
He wants to give it an opportunity, give it a chance. It's not science-based. We have the leader of the free world who does not believe in science.
But let me say this. I know we're tongue in
Call him something else.
We're tongue-in-cheeking this, but this is the president of the United States saying something about that. And he brought in Africa as Angela, as we were talking during break, he's called Africa a whole nation. It's actually a country, some of the countries. Yeah. Africa is a continent. And what part of Africa? Are you talking about sub-Saharan Africa where there are mostly black people? This is just crazy. There is a ripple effect that could happen for land, sea, for people if he did something like this. For this man to think this is the leader of the free world. There should be some... Well, he's the president of the United
supposed
States,
to be.
Angela.
He's supposed to be.
He is the
He's supposed
person
to
who
be.
anything he does and says impacts people, impacts the globe.
Until we don't let it.
Now, I think anyone who has ever been through a hurricane, seen a hurricane on TV, and has any understanding of what would happen with it when a nuclear bomb goes off, my immediate reaction was that's a bad idea. And I think anybody who has even has the least bit of familiarity with either of those phenomena knows that that's a bad idea. But here's the thing. The idea is not new. It's been floated numerous times, most famously probably right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, every time it's been brought up, it's been immediately shot down as the bad idea that we all know that it is. But what are the chances that he actually said it? I'm going to go 50-50. It could go either way. And what is the likelihood that he meant it if he said it? I mean, come on. My theory, and I think this is a theory of a number of people, that if he said it to try and flush out leakers, because he has had a serious problem, not so much of late, but his presidency has had a serious problem with people leaking stuff. And I think he probably said, what can I say that is most ridiculous that if it got out, I could immediately say it was fake news and also have an idea of who is leaking out of my administration. That's what I think. That's what I think is the most likely scenario, and the leftist media fell for it. All right, y'all. That's our show. I want to thank you all for listening. You can find us on Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, anywhere you get your podcast content. You can find us. When you do, please subscribe, leave a review, let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. You can also find me on social media. It's at The Liberty Cast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Parler. Hit me up there and let me know what you think. But again, thank you all for listening. And as usual, keep your head on a swivel and stay safe, everybody.